So welcome everybody to the last of our colloquia this year, sponsored by the Center for Law and Biomedical Sciences at the university. We're delighted to welcome today our distinguished speaker, Professor Seema Mohapatra from the University of Indiana at Indianapolis Law School. She will be speaking to us today on what might just be one of the hottest COVID topics, vaccination passports.
Thank you so much for having me here today. And thanks to Professor Francis for inviting me to be part of this series. And I assume that most of you or many of you have read my very draft paper, Passports of Privilege. And before I begin talking about the paper, which I know I already got some great questions from some of you all about it. I just wanted to frame why I decided to write this piece and how it fits into my scholarship in general and my scholarship in the last year in particular. Next slide, please. So starting last March, I started writing about the structural racism causing COVID-19 inequities, because for anyone that had been working in health equity, the way the pandemic played out is not surprising, and it was sadly predictable and was a result of a lot of both long-term and short-term government policy decisions that left certain populations more vulnerable. And so the ways that communities were and have been affected by the pandemic, from being exposed because of where they live or where they work, to being tested, to dying, to being hospitalized, and now to being vaccinated, has been impacted by race. Next slide, please. And racial minorities are being disproportionately affected with COVID-19, not due to any kind of biological differences between races, which don't exist, but rather as a result of social factors, primarily historical and current practices of discrimination. And so at the same time as COVID-19 and the infectious nature of the disease has emphasized how we're all interconnected with everyone else in our community, regardless of race, regardless of class, regardless of immigration status, the ability to actually shelter at home, to socially distance, to seek medical care, including testing and treatment, to paid sick leave, to recover from COVID-19, very considerably due to systemic and structural discrimination. And so this is an issue that Professor Rakaya Yerby at SLU and I have focused on in several works. And at the end of the slideshow, I have some links to those other works to kind of frame why I decided to write this piece. If we go to the next slide, please. And so, when we are talking about these racial disparities, often a question I get is, isn't it the same if we just look at economic factors, if we look at socioeconomic status, wouldn't it play out the same way? It would just be people that have low socioeconomic status. But actually, when we see studies that have been done, when we look at certain social determinants of health, like socioeconomic status, living in urban areas, poor and overcrowded housing, being in a high-risk population, occupation such as a long-term care worker or a meat packing plant worker, having a higher burden of comorbidities such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes, which is often due to living in food deserts and living in areas where you cannot get exercise, those all impact health and disease burden, as do institutional and interpersonal racism and discrimination. And so there was a recent study in JAMA that shows that in the US, non-white counties had higher cumulative incidences of COVID-19 and COVID-19 deaths compared with predominantly white counties. And this was true for both low income and high income communities. And that suggests that these racial disparities in COVID-19 cases and deaths exist beyond what can be explained by differences in poverty rates. And there's another study that showed that a higher rate of COVID-19 cases among ethnic minorities independent of both comorbidities and socioeconomic risk factors. And so, this suggests that the impacts of racism and social determinants of health are intertwined, and that racism shapes these social determinants of health, but also has its own effect on the health of racial and ethnic minorities. And I say that out front because that's often what I get. It's one of the first questions I always get. So now I've started to kind of frame my discussion with that in the beginning. Next slide, please. So at the same time that I was focusing on issues of structural discrimination during the pandemic, the concept of immunity passports were being floated back in May 2020, which is crazily almost a year ago. And I wrote a piece in The Conversation then about it because of my concern that they would be both unethical and potentially legally problematic, especially in light of the inequities that this pandemic was already laying bare. And at that time, immunity passports were envisioned as digital passports that showed proof of past infection with COVID-19. And it was supposed to be for travel and entry into stores and workplaces in a time when most of us were very locked down and most places were very locked down. And there's many problems with immunity passports based on natural immunity, which I'll discuss in a second. But that's kind of how I started getting interested in this topic, started writing about it. And some of you have already noted that in some parts of the paper, I've intertwined the two, which I need to fix. And I appreciate some of the comments that I got because it made me realize that I had done that. But that just frames kind of when I started researching it was almost a year ago, thinking about immunity passports based on natural immunity. Next slide, please. So the concept of what an immunity passport is in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic has shifted somewhat now that vaccinations are available not in much of the world, in much of the Western world. Now, and so what these vaccine passports, sometimes still called immunity passports, are physical documents or mobile apps that would note that the passport holder has been fully vaccinated for COVID-19. And the idea is to allow passport holders certain privileges, such as being able to travel internationally, work outside the home. And some have written about the need to use these kinds of passports in kind of more limited circumstances, like in hospitals or long-term care facilities. Now, Israel has already rolled out its immunity passport, which is called the Green Pass. And Israel's vaccine passport was released on February 21st. And that basically was supposed to help the country emerge from its lockdown. So we have a lesson, we can look at Israel's example, and I haven't added that in the paper. I added it, this week. But so the version you saw, I don't think had anything about the Green Pass in it. But so the way that Israel's plan, the Green Pass, works is that vaccinated people can download an app that displays this Green Pass and when they're asked to show it. And it also it's both a vaccine passport and an immunity passport, because it can also show that someone has recovered from COVID-19. And so, especially for people that are not old enough to get vaccinated, who are, for other reasons might not be able to get vaccinated, the Israeli government wanted to have that option as well, to show that you've already been infected. And now, when Israel opened some businesses and services in February 2021, some of those services were only allowed for people with the fully vaccinated green pass, and so those things are like gyms, swimming pools, hotels. Now they've transitioned to restaurants. They initially didn't, theaters, cultural facilities. And so those are reopening only to those who have been fully vaccinated and obtained this kind of green pass. I want to note a couple of things that are different from the Israeli example and the US context. And first is that there, as of earlier this week, it was 59% of Israel's population have received the 2 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And so that's actually the quickest vaccination rate per capita in the world so far. But I want to note that these are still passports of privilege, as I framed them in my paper, because Palestinians in the occupied territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip have largely not been vaccinated. Israel began vaccinating some Palestinians that were living in other areas in the country, but that percentage lags behind the rest of the population. And then another thing to consider is that this is not a situation of scarcity. So Israel got a whole large stock of vaccines from Pfizer-BioNTech. They paid above market price, and they also agreed to have a data sharing deal with Pfizer-BioNTech. And so there's privacy concerns with that because these passes are sharing information with Pfizer. I mean, some of the information that we've gotten, the scientific community, has benefited from, because we are learning from the Israeli example that probably fully vaccinated people, are not going to be spreading COVID-19 infection, at least, asymptomatic people are not. And so we're getting that data from that, but that was the agreement. And then, there are advocates in Israel that are also concerned with the same kind of privacy concerns that I have brought up in the paper, and that other people have brought up, because, basically the Green Pass kind of shows information, to other people that maybe, are not your doctor, about your past COVID infection status, about your vaccination status, when you recovered from COVID, for example. And there's a lot of technical issues with that Green Pass. It's supposedly the encryption that it uses is more vulnerable to security breaches, but it's not open source, and there's no one that can actually verify that that's true, if those concerns are actually founded or not. And then another difference with the Israeli example is that Israel also has a universal identity record, and it has a national medical record system, which we do not in the US. And so, I just want to kind of give that contrasting example, because some of the concerns I have in the US. I think I have some similar concerns with Israel as well. And I'm trying to weave that into the paper right now. But I want to, think about how, because we're in this pandemic, our notions of privacy are, changing so fast. And so, the fact that we wouldn't have thought about a year ago, or 13 months ago about digital immunity passports, but they're seriously being developed. President Biden has his COVID-19 response team studying the viability of these passports, and studying whether, what the pros and cons of these passports are. So this is something that is really, and then Europe is also, the EU is developing these. And so this is something that is kind of, already out of the genie's out of the bottle. And what I attempt to do in the paper is like talk about what concerns I have about that when we don't know, there's so much we don't know, and we are in a situation of scarcity, right? And so, we wouldn't have thought that we would need to be like scanning our any kind of health information or sharing health information with the YMCA and being okay with that, or with, Orange Theory. But now there's a lot of people, as people are getting vaccinated in the US, that are really hoping for that kind of freedom, to know that other people that are there are also vaccinated. And then there's also companies that are working on, digital vaccinational credentials. And, the thought is that they could be used for workplaces, for travel, for airlines, for concerts. And we also, I think I didn't include the slide that I was going to, but New York actually has been studying there's not much about it. It's called Excelsior. It's a vaccine passport that they used for a couple of games in the last month. And the only people that could actually attend those games were people that were vaccinated. And so this is something that we are also, in the US have already kind of started using and trying out. And, in terms of the whole title of my paper and what I am, worried about is that I think that there is a concern that these kinds of vaccination cards or immunity passports could be used as passports in privilege, and also could, we're shifting resources to consider the viability of these, rather than like looking at the huge structural problems that we have that are maybe harder to fix. And that is what, like, the goal of the paper and my, contribution to the symposium is. If we go to the next slide, please. So, when we're, like, what I kind of consider, I kind of gave you guys an overview of what immunity passports and vaccine passports are. Kind of gave you a thought of, how they could be used. I'm going to talk about the legality of them. I'm going to talk about some of the ethical concerns and what I see as the way forward. If we go to the next slide. Okay, so some of you might have already been vaccinated, and if you have that, this is the kind of vaccination card that you got in the US. And so these are from the CDC, and they're printed vaccination cards for use by anyone who has received a COVID-19 vaccination. And the purpose of the card is to just kind of show details about when you got a vaccine, and that you remind you of when you should get the next one, what lot number it is. But that kind of vaccine card is already being used as proof of immune status. And so one example is Boston in Massachusetts. They just made it an exception for the quarantining requirement that they had if you're fully vaccinated and it's been 2 weeks after your second vaccine, and then you have to bring proof of your vaccine card. And so, this is already being used in some way, and there is much speculation that we could have a more high-tech version of it, as the Biden administration has directed the task force to study, to gain entry into places that would be restricted to people that were not vaccinated or were not immune. And so some cities like LA already are, have a partnership with Apple to try to have digital vaccination cards instead of these paper cards. And those digital cards would be on your Apple Wallet. And so that is, we're getting closer to the immunity passport concept. And one of the problems, that I have with this whole concept is that even when and if as President Biden has indicated, by May 1st, any adult that wants to get a vaccine should be able to get a vaccine. We have so many problems with accessing the vaccines, and we have so many problems with trusting the vaccine that this seems like an effort that, this could be an and kind of effort, but it shouldn't be an or effort, right? And so, when we're thinking about these, if we go to the next slide, when we're thinking about these immunity or vaccine passports, the areas that they have been talked about the most is for travel, for leisure activities like concerts, theater, gyms, indoor restaurants, and also to access certain kinds of workplaces, especially workplaces where there may be vulnerable people, like long-term care facilities and hospitals. Now, when prior to the authorization of the vaccines, there were already mobile apps that were being developed to show natural immunity. There were a lot of problems with the natural immunity model because it is a novel virus. We don't know how long the natural immunity lasts. And so in certain areas, there was a certification being given in certain countries, and it was like for 3 months. But we're not really sure how long immunity lasts. And now, especially in light of the variants, and that we have a lot of cases of people that had COVID-19 infection that were reinfected, it is not clear what the efficacy of those, vaccine or those immunity passports really are. And there were also concerns initially that, the antibody tests that would be testing for COVID-19 infection, whether those were even valid. And so a lot of the parts of the paper that are about the antibodies, you can probably tell I had written it in May when it was, when that was happening. And so I'm probably going to remove some of those pieces because I don't think there's that much interest or, there should be that much focus on the natural immunity. But because there are some people that would not, either ever take the vaccine, either because of their age or their health status, or because they don't want to take the vaccine, there is kind of a push to have these passports still have natural immunity, have them in it. And there, were concerns before the vaccine that people would, in order to access, whether it's work or access leisure activities, that they would try to get infected with COVID-19, especially if you're young and, you are seeing that young people are not having the same kinds of serious impacts as older people. But the problem is that we don't, people don't know how they are going to be reacting. And we do see a racial differential in terms of who has more serious COVID-19 infection when they're younger. And it is most, people that are African-American, Latino, Pacific Islanders, and Indigenous people are having more serious cases at a younger age for a whole host of reasons that I had, mentioned earlier. And so, in terms of, and dying at higher rates. So, in order to have an immunity passport, to be benefiting from it, from natural immunity, you have to have survived, right? And so already on that front, that is a privilege. And I use the example that Catherine Oliverius from Stanford, who is a historian, she wrote a book about 19th century New Orleans, and during the yellow fever outbreak, when it was endemic to the area, basically anyone who got yellow fever and actually survived, it was deadly. And so if you actually survived, you were known as being acclimated. And if you were acclimated, you had a whole host of financial opportunities, like working, because you're basically can't get it again. And so you could work inside, people's homes. You could, basically earn a living. And so there were, and she refers to this as immunocapital. And there were people, immigrants, that were purposefully trying to get yellow fever in order for this chance to succeed. And so, when we know, what the statistics are about COVID-19 infection, and the fact that we have Black, Latinx, and Indigenous populations who have died at a higher rate than white people, immunity itself is skewed by privilege. And so I will say that these naturally acquired immunity passports were essentially a non-starter for the most part, except for these exceptions that I'm telling you, because the vaccines were developed so quickly. And so one question that I'm happy to discuss after in our discussion is like whether I should just take that out completely. I'm not sure if I should or not, because I'm kind of going back and forth, and I feel like it's a little confusing. And so I'm happy to get feedback and suggestions on that. But, since now there's been several vaccines, 3 vaccines that are authorized by the FDA, the interest in immunity passports have kind of shifted to these vaccination passports. And there's, they have another set of concerns that I talk about, but I want to talk about some of the legal aspects of these passports, and I go into it in more detail. And so, I conclude that they are legal, right? So in the paper, I go through kind of Jacobson versus Massachusetts as a case that probably most of you are familiar with, a smallpox mandatory vaccination case that was until this summer kind of used as the main public health law case that showed that states have police powers that could justify these kinds of mandatory vaccination schemes. And we have a lot of context, especially K through 12 schools and certain workplaces like hospitals where there is already mandatory vaccinations that are allowable. We had, there's a great article that is out that I think came out yesterday by Glenn Cohen and Dorit Rice from Hastings about how even under the EUA, they said that they believe that K through 12 students could be vaccinated. There could be mandatory vaccinations for K through 12 students, even when it's under an EUA. There's a question about whether school districts would do that, or if they would rather have, kind of a carrot approach rather than a stick approach. But that is, and this is all still really theoretical because we don't have any vaccines yet that are authorized for under 16. My kids are 13 and 16. They both were in a Pfizer trial. They're both fully vaccinated, and there was no placebo in the trial. And so and that trial is almost done. So I'm hopeful for the next age group. They're gonna, maybe seek EUA approval for the 12 to 16. And then just this week, Moderna started having clinical trials at least open for even 6 months, kids 6 months of age. But at least we know legally that there is a framework where you could have mandatory vaccinations. And, we know that the EEOC has even given a green light for mandatory vaccinations under an EUA in a workplace situation, which a lot of people did not think would happen. And so, because of COVID-19 being seen as a direct threat under the EEOC, we see that there is, more of a kind of leniency about whether you can have mandatory vaccinations or not. Now, in terms of, other concerns, there's concerns about what it means for people that for disability related reasons could not get a vaccine, which would be regulated by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And, when employers can usually are not allowed to ask about any kind of disability and in the workplace. But because COVID-19 is a direct threat, the EEOC has stated that disability-related inquiries can be asked when the vaccine is given, as long as it's by a third party that's not controlled by the employer. So like a pharmacy or a healthcare provider that's not under contract by the employer, or a healthcare care provider. And the EEOC, though, noted, and so did Glenn Cohen and Dorit Rice's article, that because of our current jurisprudence in terms of religious exemptions, they would need to exempt people who had religious beliefs from preventing them to get the vaccine. So that's one area that I've really not explored in this paper that I'm thinking about expanding and talking about. There's a couple reasons I haven't explored it. But I'm thinking about exploring whether that population is another population, people with sincerely held religious beliefs, anti-vaccine, that are, cannot get vaccinations, not anti-vax people, but people that for sincerely held religious beliefs. I'm hesitant to go into that because I really don't want some parts of my article to be taken by people that are anti-vax and used in that way. And so that's why I've avoided them. I have had that issue happen to me before when I've written about disability rights in the context and reproductive rights at the same time. And so I'm a little hesitant about that. So that's why I haven't done that, but that is something that I'm considering. And then of course, HIPAA is not even an issue because in most of these cases, because HIPAA only applies to those that are involved in healthcare payment, treatment, or operations. And so even though there is clearly a privacy concern, we don't have a comprehensive privacy law like the GDPR in Europe. We have some state laws like the California Consumer Privacy Act that may bring more hurdles for those that are thinking about using immunity passports via vaccines. But there is, I don't think legal problems are going to be the issue here. There's also a proposed bill, the Public Health Emergency Privacy Act, that is proposed to protect pandemic-related health data. And that is also supposed to be a little bit more comprehensive in terms of protection because of the emergency situation with COVID. And so, I go into more detail on all of these things in the paper. But, I think that even if they're legal, I think there's some serious ethical problems here. If we go to the next slide, please. And so, I definitely don't think that they're ethical. We live in this tiered society where Black Americans, Indigenous Americans, Latinx Americans are bearing the brunt of the pandemic, and they're getting vaccinated at much lower rates than other races. So it's 2 to 4 times. I looked at Kaiser Family Foundation today. Depending on the race, it's 2 to 4 times of white population. And we're seeing this countrywide, but in certain areas, it's even more, more stark. And so a passport based on vaccination, when such vaccinations are scarce, is not fair. And so I got a question from a student, and I'll address it here because I think it's related, that, if this is just a temporary fix, what's the problem with it if it's just a temporary fix until we reach herd immunity? And there's a couple of responses that I have for that. And so, the idea is that these passports would be in place till herd immunity, but that's not going to happen this year. And globally, there's reports that wouldn't happen till 2023 or 2024. So we're talking about 2 to 3 years at least. And there's serious concerns about what the implications are for privacy going forward. So, when we're used to scanning in to get, theaters and restaurants and planes, there's many bioethicists like me. Nita Farhani wrote a op-ed about this for Stat News, about worrying about how this kind of surveillance infrastructure would be used post-pandemic, right? So the notion of this kind of big brother type of government app that can track where you are is quite concerning, and even if it worked, there's serious privacy considerations about how this would be rolled, what the end game of this would be. If that infrastructure is in place, what else would it be used for? And so it is a good idea to be considering these issues before we start with a large scale plan. And, we really have it could still really create a chilling implication for privacy going forward. There's serious concerns still about equity, right? And we don't have universal access to the vaccines. When we have universal access to vaccines, there is still a reason to be concerned that certain populations might not want to take the vaccine. And so we need to be making sure that our health communication is, we're doing a better job in talking about building trust. There's been lots of studies about this that have been written. They do not like saying that, okay, well, we're going to coerce you to do this because otherwise you're not going to get certain benefits, doesn't seem like a wise, way forward, right? And right now, I think Pfizer in a month or so is probably going to go for full authorization, but right now everything is just under full approval. Right now it's just authorized. And so that also, for people that might be a little bit more risk averse, might have reason to distrust the government because of, past abuses in the communities, or, because of past current abuses, like lack of access to vaccinations, right? Lack of access to treatment for COVID-19, things that are happening, the scarcity that's occurring right now in the pandemic is enough to have people lose trust. And so I think there's better ways to deal with it than thinking about these kinds of passports. If we get the next slide. So I kind of talked about that. I'll go to the next one. And I want to also note how the populations, such as the African American population, are being used a little bit as tools by anti-vax vaxxers right now. And so there's reports of kind of these documentaries about how the COVID-19 vaccine is unsafe, using kind of graphics that are based on Harriet Washington's medical apartheid, using fears about how the medical system is, racist, to try to get more people on board for there's lots of reasons to be concerned, even when every American can have access to a vaccine. We have to think about how we're delivering that. Are those people coming to those communities, people that are with disabilities that are homebound? Are people coming in right now with the recovery plan that was just approved? There is enough money for vaccinations that we should be focusing on those kinds of equity measures that could hopefully get people that want to be vaccinated, and that could get our health communication in a way where more people would be convinced that they should, that they would want to get a vaccine. If we get to the next slide. And so, I just kind of, my thesis in the piece is just basically that it's too premature right now. We shouldn't be thinking about this as an easy fix where there's people that can get, vaccinated and, basically live their lives and not worry about the rest of the people that aren't. And this is not just a US issue. This is a global issue. And so, even if the US has access to vaccinations, as a global citizen, there is a need to make sure that all countries have access to vaccinations. And there's also a concern about, with these digital passports, are we going to trust all the vaccination from every other country, like whether it's China or the Sputnik vaccine, when we haven't seen any kind of peer-reviewed data, you have to think about all of those kinds of things, which also have then political consequences in the decisions you make for them. And the next slide. And, so in the paper, I just talk about some of the and I think I actually didn't talk about it yet. I'm adding some of the material from the health justice framework to talk about some of the things that we need to make sure that these inequities that we have in society don't exist, don't continue to occur, pandemic after pandemic. And some of these things are, there's an opportunity right now with the recovery plan to focus on some of these things, but we see that even the minimum wage did not, wasn't in this plan. And so that there is some difficulties in a long road ahead here. But I think that the focus on equity, this is the time to be focusing on that and not like necessarily a technological fix. And so the next slide, please. So these are some of the readings that I was telling you that you didn't read, but these are all on SSRN, and the last two are also out online. So if you would like to read some of this information about structural racism with the pandemic, I'm happy to, lead you to those. And if you can email me if you want a copy of it. And then the next slide. So I'm happy to now take questions and suggestions. I know I also have other questions that I didn't answer, and I'm happy to do that, but I'll let Professor Francis kind of tell me which ones I should do. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. This is, I'm sure, a topic that is going to generate a lot of really good discussion. I see a couple of hands up already, so I'll go to Blake Faulkner.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the wonderful presentation, really interesting stuff. I actually have two questions. The first one, you showed some statistics on the Israeli application of the vaccine passports early in your presentation. I was curious if there's any data to suggest that the implementation of that passport increased the adoption of the vaccine, or whether it would have been, I think it was 59% you said, whether it would have been roughly the same had they not implemented that.
That's a very good question. I haven't seen anything like that, but that is one thing that has been in the literature about vaccine passports in general, of that it could, perhaps encourage, people to take the vaccination because they get these benefits from it, and that has been seen as a positive. And so it's very possible. So, with the Israel example, they have been vaccinating very fast, because when they started the Green Pass, it was only about a third of the population that was vaccinated, fully vaccinated. And now they're at 59%. And, it looks like, they're continuing to go. But that is a good, that would be a good qualitative study. I'm sure people are doing it to see if that influenced them in terms of that they could actually, especially people that might not have feared any kind of serious infection from COVID-19, if that encouraged them to get vaccinations. And that's one of the things in the literature that has been suggested might be a positive thing about vaccine passports.
Okay. And thanks. And then my other question is, you mentioned that that they are considering requiring a passport for things such as travel, leisure, or work, right? Which, I would say most, if not all of those things are pretty fundamental to everybody's life. And I feel like it creates a situation where it's pretty easy to argue that it's essentially a mandatory vaccine. I think it's easy to make that argument. And so I don't presume to be any sort of con law expert, but I am curious. It seems like that would raise some constitutional issues, right? Kind of, it feels like a distinction without a difference, requiring a a passport and saying this isn't mandatory, right? It essentially would be. And so I'm curious kind of,
And I think I didn't make that probably clear in the paper, and I probably should. You're making me think I should. So the reason I started talking about mandatory, and I should definitely make that clear, is because we could actually make it mandatory, right? And so if it's less than mandatory, like a coercive impact, a vaccine passport, legally, it's probably okay, right? If you can go as far as being mandatory. The difference, though, is that when you have something mandatory, you still need to make sure that you have some kind of reasonable accommodations, for somebody under the ADA. There are some, religious exemptions. There are some kinds of exemptions. It's not clear for a, vaccine passport scheme, right? Like if you can't get on a flight, because of your religious beliefs, or because you physically cannot take a vaccination because of a disability, or having to kind of out yourself because you have a hidden disability that you might not want to kind of disclose. There's lots of issues that go into that, and that might be more, problematic, especially if these businesses or workplaces are not willing to make these kinds of reasonable accommodations. And I think we might start seeing that because it doesn't seem like masking or PPE or, in some of these contexts is going to be enough. At least in the Israel example, it doesn't appear that to be the case. In the US, because our legal scheme is different and we have more individual liberties, it's perhaps that it would play out a different way, if we had these kinds of passports.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lydia.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, I do think that it would be really interesting to engage with some of those religious tensions, because that's where I see kind of the biggest issue coming from this is not necessarily people like, say, your average Joe who, gets the vaccine, has a vaccine passport possibly, and just goes and lives his life. But it's really, I think where you're going to see a lot of the tension come from is those people who have sincerely held religious beliefs of, well, I don't want to be vaccinated, but I'd like to travel, or I don't want to be vaccinated, but I would like to work at my job. And I think that is a really important area to kind of wrestle with. I think especially it'd be interesting to talk about it in regards to like contraception too, because can be like a personal and religious decision, but it's also a healthcare decision. And after Hobby Lobby, how much can your employer really dictate that? And I think that would be a really interesting conversation to have.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been thinking about it, and I guess and I think you're right. I think I should include it. I just want to be careful how I include it, like not providing some kind of roadmap to exemptions, so I do. And I think that is actually, what we've seen in the litigation with just COVID-19 restrictions, with the Supreme Court in the last few months. We've seen that basically, religious views, religious organizations have kind of a most favored nation status. And so, religious exemptions seem to be very important to this court. So I think that would be the one. One thing is that in some jurisdictions, they're taking away the personal exemptions. Like if you just have a belief that you don't believe in vaccinations, they're taking those away, but not taking the religious exemptions away. I need to engage with that. I think it's a good idea. You can see that I'm reluctant, but I think you're right. I think I need to do that.
Dave Duncan, welcome back. Dave is one of our former fellows.
Well, thank you. And thank you for this. This is a very interesting presentation. So my question is, so you talked about a few different types of immunities, if you've already had it, or if you've had the vaccines. But with so many different strains of it now and the mutations that are out there, like I was looking at the next strain database, and I mean, there are literally thousands of them, and we don't know how those interact with the vaccines, or, you know, with, I had one variant, am I immune from the other variant? What does immunity even mean in this scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is another, and I think I probably need to devote a little bit more to that, you know, because what we're seeing in some of the vaccine, you know, like with, for example, the J&J vaccine, some of the percentages difference in terms of efficacy is not really necessarily because of efficacy. It's just that there's more variants at the time when they were doing the studies. And so if the studies for Pfizer and Moderna were at the same time, we might have had similar kind of less efficacy. And, you know, one thing that you could say is that the variants are actually a reason to step up the vaccinations, right? That's what I think, you know, we need to do, is to have more efforts, you know, community-based efforts, more efforts of people going to the places where people are, making sure that we don't have to have, you know, even when we're having zip code tailored vaccination kind of clinics, we see that people that don't live in that zip code are often the ones that are getting it. Now, that scarcity, hopefully in the next couple months, is going to go away, but then we're going to still have people that, because of their jobs, because of, you know, whatever reason, have not been able to get vaccinated. And we need to make sure that we get them vaccinated as soon as possible. Because what it looks like right now is that if we have, like, if we reach kind of herd immunity, it doesn't matter what these kind of variants are. But the problem is that when we have over 50% of the variants in the population, that's when we see this big, steep kind of resurgence. And some people are fearing that that's what we're going to have here.
Karthik.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm slightly embarrassed that it seems like you read all of my questions, but also really appreciate your response.
I sent some ahead, including one, but without identifying people.
Yeah, I didn't know who it was. So you just outed yourself.
So one of the recurring questions to me that came up throughout the entire piece is whether you think of the COVID vaccine and COVID in general as categorically different than, say, flu, MMR, other things where we require vaccines both in education and in occupation. Since it seems like that was... it seems like if I concede all of the points in the paper, then it would erode the requirements that we have for other vaccinations.
So, right. So I would say I don't, you know, like in general, I would say I don't, because I assume that soon we're going to have fully approved vaccinations, not just authorized vaccinations. There, you know, I think that already, you know, in terms of the way that we proceed in this country, we have very limited mandatory vaccinations. You know, it is limited to usually schools, and some universities have, you know, private universities have some kinds of requirements, and even some public universities have some kinds of requirements. For workplaces, it's mostly for when, you know, if you're around, like for flu, and, you know, it's for if you're with vulnerable people, like in a hospital. But even in those cases, if you don't want to take it, they have, you know, you can wear a mask, you can have other, there's alternatives to that. It's not that like, oh, you just can't get on this plane, or you just can't go to this gym, or you can't, you know, you can't participate in life when other people can. And so that's what I see as different between, you know, vaccinations in general, how they're used, and how it's, you know, being proposed to be being used, and is it worth it, right? Like if we are already going to be, if we can use public health communication efforts, if we can use, you know, efforts to regain trust within those communities, if we can actually make, you know, have access to healthcare within those communities, access like through the American, you know, recovery plan right now, we have, you know, extended sick leave, or, you know, rental assistance. If we can kind of focus on some of these issues, and then at the same time focus on getting more people vaccinated, is there a benefit of having an infrastructure where you can potentially be tracked, where you're giving your private information, whether it is about, your vaccination status or your, past COVID infection status, and what else can that be used for, right? Like if you already have that in place, and we've seen this in many other emergency situations where we have a, kind of a fear-based response, whether it was 9/11 with some of our, security kinds of concerns. And then even when we don't have that fear or that need for that fear anymore, that infrastructure still remains. And I think that is one of the things that makes it different as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Thank you.
Are there other, I've got a question up my sleeve, but one other question I got last night was about, there are some, I could say otherwise disadvantaged groups that have been hard hit by COVID, where immunization rates are actually pretty high. The Navajo in Utah and in the Four Corners region are an example where I think the figure is pretty close to Israel's figure.
It is.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I'm actually really familiar with the Navajo example because Rakaya and I use it in the Emory paper as an example of like what we should be doing, in terms of having partnerships from they have Indian Health Service partnerships and partnerships with people within the community they're getting the vaccines transported to those areas. There's this, whole infrastructure that has been very successful for these, to get a community that was hard hit by COVID-19, get them vaccinated. And so that is like a very good success story. I think that one of the questions that I got was, shouldn't we kind of advantage a group that is getting vaccinated, that is putting their trust in the vaccine with these privileges, of immunity or vaccine passports. And my answer to that would be that, I think that the focus would be better to reward those communities with not just healthcare access and access to vaccines and treatments when there is a global pandemic where people are worried about their, people spreading to them, but that, that you're concerned and invested in those communities and that you're there not only in emergency situations. And so some of the long-term chronic health issues facing the Navajos, having those kinds of access to those services and having, community people trained physicians from that community. There's so many things that I think that we could, reward, the question was reward those kinds of communities. But I think one of the, in terms of studying what that, the vaccination, what they have done, it's a great partnership with the Indian Health Service, and some of the community health workers have been known to people in the community for a long time, and even from the Indian Health Service. It's not like they just saw them for the first time right now because of COVID-19 vaccinations. And I think that makes a big difference in terms of getting trust within, people that are there already, and you have reason to believe that this is a safe vaccine. We've seen this, we've seen this with, in certain groups that, a group of Black doctors, the Black Doctors Collective did vaccination clinics in Philadelphia, and they saw that, people that they talked to that initially were like, not, in the neighborhood that they were in, that were initially like, no, I'm not going to get vaccinated, that were in the qualified age to get vaccinated, by the end of the weekend that they were there, they changed a lot of minds. And there's a lot of data out there that when you have healthcare providers that look like you, that are concordant race, that you have better health outcomes as well. And the people that have the least concordant race in the U.S. are African Americans, Latinos, and indigenous people.
Michael.
So I'm thinking how to ask this, and I'm kind of internally struggling, so bear with me if I sound like an idiot. But it seems to me like the bulk of people that don't want to get vaccines or are reticent to do so are either those that are, and this is just from my anecdotal evidence, they seem to be those that are entitled or those that have been historically disenfranchised. And I'm kind of wondering how we can encourage these groups better and build that trust that you were talking about, like with the Native American populations. And one thing that I'm wondering, instead of like an incentive program, to me, I immediately balk at, because like, why do I need to be incentivized if this thing just works? Like, if this is a good product, I don't need an advertisement to show me I'm going to look for it. And I'm wondering if there's like a parallel push to have more public information about vaccines, or maybe partnerships with groups like churches where you would need a vaccine passport to get these kind of groups that tend to be less trusting of these scientific developments.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that first, the group that is the most vaccine hesitant in surveys right now are white male Republicans. And so that is the group that is the most, in the latest Pew poll that came out, that is the, more than half of white Republicans said that they were unsure if they would take the COVID-19 vaccine, and they were less inclined than Black and Latinx individuals in that poll. But still, even with the fact that the percentage in the poll of people that were willing to get the vaccine was higher for Black Americans and Latinx Americans, we saw that those populations are getting fewer vaccines and still dying at higher rates, right? And that's, it's like 3 months into the rollout. But one of the things that we're seeing in terms of what you're saying and why do you have to sell it? So, part of it is that it sells itself. When more people in your community that are getting it, there's been studies that show that when people that have gotten vaccinated, you're more likely to change your mind and get vaccinated, right? Without any kind of health communication strategy or anything. So it's just getting more people vaccinated is more likely to get more people vaccinated in itself. Now, in terms of why we need to have, any kind of like marketing, part of it is that we are kind of facing mixed messages. There is there is an effort, really, especially targeting African Americans, to kind of sow distrust. And so, this year, I'm teaching at an HBCU at FAMU, and I teach public health law this semester. It's been really interesting because just people talking about their experiences with the healthcare system, and these are all law students and like very smart, educated, and the kinds of I'm like able to see it with my students. And I had Professor Ross Silverman, who is an expert on vaccines, come and talk to my class last week. And, some of their questions were like, why would we trust this vaccine? So there's definitely still that hesitancy. And I don't know if that hesitancy is there necessarily with people that are making that calculation, like if they're over 60 or 65, that they're going to have higher risk. But with, these are law school age students, I think there is a need for, to regain trust that is actually justifiably not there, because of experiences. So, I had students, I had one student last week talk about how she was on Medicaid, when she didn't have insurance, and that she was going to get a medicine or a shot. And then the nurse was like, no, that's for people with insurance, and then gave her a different shot. Like, things like that, where it's like, why would you trust the system when you've had experiences like that? So I definitely think there are populations with that, but I don't think that's where we are right now. We're still in a question of, we don't have access. I mean, the distrust right now is coming from the fact that for so many months, we've known that we're going to have a vaccine. We've had the national academies. We've had the, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. We've had the WHO group, I forgot, SAGE group, come up with all these vaccine frameworks, prioritizing equity. All of them are prioritizing equity. When the CDC's committee, ACIP, on vaccinations, they considered equity, and they put the groups, the phasing groups, but all the first few phases of the vaccine are all predominantly white, right? They didn't even, and a lot of states just ignored the phasing that included essential workers, and, completely went to an age-based kind of system. So we're seeing the reason for distrust play out, because that age-based system really disadvantages African Americans who have a shorter life expectancy, and then also, like, in terms of serious COVID at younger ages, we're seeing African Americans and Latino people having more serious consequences. And so a 65-year-old in one racial community might have a totally different risk profile than, a 45-year-old that works, whether, on in a meat processing plant, for example, right? I don't know if I answered your question, but I just talked for a long time.
You want to follow up, Michael, or?
Well, I'm just like, I'm processing and I'm thinking, and I'm not sure if I might just talk past you here as well. But another thing that just has kind of crossed my mind is legitimacy of vaccine safety. Like, I'm pretty confident they're fine from everything I hear, but like, I heard the AstraZeneca vaccine was just taken off from a few countries because of blood clotting issues, I think. Don't quote me on that. Right. But like, if something, thank you, I'm getting a thumbs up from Jim. But if, we haven't had long-term test trials, is there a fear that some people's concerns are more valid than we think? And then what do these kind of incentive programs look like retrospectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally valid. And that's one of the reasons, part of the framing of the vaccine, development program under the Trump administration of warp speed really did some harm in terms of trust, because when you look at actually the numbers of people that have been in trials, it's been very similar numbers to the numbers that in previous vaccines that were not, that were rolled out not necessarily in an emergency. Even the EUA programs, that is the EUA programs were not just created during this during this pandemic. They have been for these emergency situations where we need to get treatments or testing or, in this case, vaccinations kind of to the people faster, but no corners were cut. But that needs to be out there. There needs to be kind of trusted people, so it's not like propaganda, so that you can see the data. The reality is we don't know what the long-term consequences of these vaccines are, because the longest people have had them as 6 months, or I guess people were in the trial over the summer, and so we don't have that data. But these technology, at least for Moderna and Pfizer, the mRNA technology has been used, before. It's not that it was just developed now. The J&J vaccine uses traditional kind of, vaccine technology, but I think that's a valid concern. And I think that is where that health communication is important, because there's nothing there's nothing kind of wrong with questioning whether, and especially if you're in a risk profile that is not, high risk, like maybe you would say, like, I'm just going to hold off, right? In these cases. And so I think what you were saying before is that might be, vaccine passports might be a way for people that would be in that situation to say, okay, well, I'm just going to get it so that I can go, to this concert, or I can go to the gym, or, on a plane.
Heather Tanana put a comment in the chat that I just want to call people's attention to about the Utah partnership with the Navajo health system and how the vaccines actually got.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really interesting because our Urban Indian Center here in Salt Lake, their dose came from Indian Health Service. And part of the reason for that initially also was with when you initially had the freezer and how cold it could be stored, and a lot of the tribes and these smaller clinics that don't have the capacity, yada, yada. Anyway, so UNHS, I think they've just been on our Utah side. Navajo is really small portion down there. New Mexico, Arizona is much larger, but they were able to work with the state. And that's where their dosage comes from. And I just think you talk about high vaccination rates, they just are so involved with the community down there. And so, the physicians, their community advocates, they know the community members. So when they're calling in, they're asking them, hey, have you had your COVID test yet or vaccine yet? Oh, so that I think also plays into it, that there's this, yes, historic mistrust with the federal government, but a lot of that's tied with the testing. And so once it was approved, then it was much easier to get the community on board, and just the direct level they had, which is so different from me going over to University of Utah Health System. I mean, I honestly don't know my primary care physician at all. And so it's just different. Yeah.
Were these relationships intact like for years beforehand, or, is that kind of the way that it has worked?
I think I would say it's a more recent development. I mean, UNHS, so our Urban Indian Center up here in Salt Lake, their service population is solely enrolled federal members of, enrolled members of federally recognized tribes. That's their service population. So a non-native can't go over to Urban Indian Center and get a vaccine. But UNHS, even their tribally operated 501c3 nonprofit, and they do get IHS funding. It's a really unique, you don't have this often in the tribal clinical systems and IHS systems, because they have been authorized by Navajo Nation to get IHS monies, but they're not really tribal. It's not really what we think of with a tribally operated clinic. But yeah, so I think the response, one, that they serve non-natives to begin with, all the tourists that come down in the summer, a lot of heat stroke, and then we're just able to partner, I think, really early on. Utah Department of Health got data sharing agreements with all of the 8 Utah tribes to kind of help with COVID testing and COVID numbers. And we as a state have not always had the best of relationships with the tribes. And so I think that it's one area where it's worked out, and hopefully again, like, they can take that partnership and continue exactly like you said, right? Like, continue the funding and just working together, because they are San Juan County. A lot of people in Blanding, that's where they got their shots from UNHS, the non-native population too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's great to hear, and kind of also as kind of an example of a potentially good model too.
So I want to ask a question on the other side. I'm anticipating teaching in person in the fall. I'm also anticipating that there won't be herd immunity in my class. That is, my assumption is that there'll be 20, 25% of students if they're like the population in Utah, who simply, it's not that they didn't have access to vaccines, but it's that they've chosen not to be vaccinated. I may be wrong about that. I hope I'm wrong about that. But, if you look at the population numbers, I think it's a fair guess that there might be a quarter that are unvaccinated. I'm also quite sure that I will have some students who, for medical reasons, either can't be vaccinated or who have a more difficult sort of picture with respect to immunity. So I don't think we're as clear about how well immunization works in somebody who's either immunosuppressed because they have an autoimmune condition or in some other way is immune compromised. I'm also aware that you can't, at least formally under the ADA, claim accommodation based on your association with a person with a disability. So, eventually somebody who lives with such a compromised person is also not going to be able to claim disability accommodation, even though they might be able to do so for themselves. But the fact that a quarter of the class, and we won't know who they are, will be walking around unvaccinated, basically puts the burden on my students with disabilities or with family members with disabilities, either to stay home and sacrifice some of their education. When there are folks out there that are basically, in my judgment, behaving in a somewhat, or at least perhaps thinking only of themselves rather than thinking of their contribution to the herd. So, although I'm a privacy advocate, I would like to know, I don't care who, but I would like to know what percentage of my class is unvaccinated. I might also like to be able to set up my classroom, although this really reveals, so that the unvaccinated, because we may not be able to maintain social distancing. I hope we'll be able to keep a mask mandate, but I don't know. So how should I be reacting to all this?
Yeah, I'm probably in the same, I'm probably in the same boat also in terms of, so IU and I'm moving to St. John's, and St. John's, they're both planning on being in person, planning not to have an online kind of option the way that they do now for people that are like, that can't come in. They're planning on not being socially distanced. And I think that this is going to be a struggle that we all are going to be facing. And so that's why I think like Dorit and Glenn's article is so interesting, because obviously a lot of colleges and universities are considering whether to make, vaccinations mandatory. It is, in their piece, they did acknowledge that it is a little bit more challenging for a public school, so like University of Utah, to do that, and IU. And then it is also, there's a question of, a lot of students with disabilities had for a long time been requesting accommodations from, different ways of learning that were never kind of accommodated, whether it is remote learning or, different methods. But then when this became, this happened, all schools kind of went overnight. So we know that it is possible. So I really hope that our schools do kind of learn some lessons from that and have more accommodations for people with disabilities. But I do agree that, like IU had a special COVID-19 exemption that wasn't ADA for people that lived with people with disabilities. But that's not an ADA. And it doesn't sound like they're going to still do that next year. And I don't know if, in terms of like knowing how to situate people, that also is stigmatizing, right? For people that have disabilities that they don't want to disclose of why they're not vaccinated. So I agree with you, but I probably feel the same kind of nerves and ambivalence as you do, especially because we don't know how long this vaccine-induced immunity lasts. We don't know if it lasts, with the different variants. So there's a lot of things that this is not going to be over. I know people want it to be over. It's not going to be over in 6 months. And no matter how much we will it to be. And so I think part of these kinds of plans are also kind of made with financial, goals in mind, in terms of getting students, saying that you're going to be in person and everything's going to be back to normal so that you get students. But I think that hopefully there is some reality, like this might not actually happen, right? But I don't know it, like speaking to my dean, it definitely sounds like he's serious, so maybe that's just like a faculty member's like dream, like you really have a backup plan, right? But
I guess part of the point of my question is, if the backup plan is that people with the disabilities or people who are more susceptible to COVID have to stay home, while the folks who are unvaccinated, kind of feeling invulnerable and maybe less vulnerable, get to have the full benefits of in-person education.
Yeah, so you're saying that itself has an inequity.
Right. I would rather flip
I agree. I don't know what the answer to that is,
vaccine passports, I'm convinced they're heavy-handed and that it would be better to do all these other things. But if my choice is between putting the burden on my students with diabetes and MS or whatever else the condition might be, or putting the burden on folks who are enjoying going to bars every night or whatever, I know which way I think ethically I'd rather put.
That's a good. I'm going to include that. That's a good counterpoint that I think is, where you're going to put the risk and the onus on it. And I think that's a good question to, like, at least for me to bring up and think through in terms of the fairness of these, and the other way where it could actually be beneficial for people with disabilities that can't get vaccinated themselves, and then would be able to also, because if we reach herd immunity, we get, people that are not vaccinated, it won't, they'll be also protected the way that it works.
So I see a hand went up from Karthik.
So this is unrelated to that topic, but that is interesting. I was just thinking about being a global citizen, and it strikes me that Congress doesn't have the power to regulate international travel between all of the countries of the world, but it does have the power to regulate transit into our country. And at this moment, there are stockpiles in more developed or richer nations that preclude other countries, and those of greatest concern to me are Brazil and South Africa, from getting vaccines, which means that variants are going to sort of run amok in South America, and potentially in Africa as well. And I guess my question to you is, do you think that a vaccine passport either exacerbates any of these issues of stockpiling, and I guess how, and then also whether arguing against a vaccine passport is essentially saying that like perfect is the enemy of the good in some way, and that like we should allow some transit between some people, and maybe the vaccinated people should be the ones to do it because they're the safest.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and I think, and I want to also be a little bit like, and I probably should put this in the, and I don't know if I did in the article. It's not that I don't think vaccine passports for some limited purposes in a time when there's not scarcity wouldn't be okay. I think that there is a time where it could be okay. I just don't think that time is now. Now, in terms of like hoarding of vaccinations, like if you are, we are doing that right now, right? Like the Biden administration is doing that right now. We are holding on to more of a stock of vaccines. And so until we get, everybody, vaccinated, and we have enough to get everybody vaccinated, the question, the thought is that we need to think about the fact that the way that we even have COVID-19 is, it didn't come from, the US. We need to realize that until we have kind of COVID-19 eradicated, or to when it's the level of the common cold or, the flu or, whatever level, we can't just go about our business. It's impossible. It's going to, keep coming back, and we're going to keep having issues and deaths to deal with. I think that in terms of, perfect being the enemy of the good, I think that is a fair, and that is one of the, critiques about vaccine passports. There are, and I cite them, but there are people that are bioethicists that are, very much like in favor of limited vaccine passports and think that that they're okay. It's kind of funny. I've noticed that it has gone down in gender lines pretty notably, which is strange because doesn't seem to be like a gender component of this, but the bioethicists that seem to be okay with it, that have been publishing on it, are males, and the bioethicists that are not okay with it have been females. So, it's a small sample size, but I think that is a fair point. I would say that I don't know if it's good. I don't know. I wouldn't say that, the kind of a two-tier society where some people are going to like live like they can normally do and have no incentive to really get others on board is really the way that we want to go. And especially in, with the shadow of a pandemic that has impacted groups so differently. If you are a Black American, you're much likely to have known someone that has died of COVID-19 than if you're of any other race in this country. There's lots of ways that it has been impacted. So I think that we need to think about the equity issues. Now, in terms of like thinking about globally, if we do enact these kinds of passports for international travel, for people coming into the country to protect the country, we have to realize that the people that are planning on traveling in these countries to our country or to other countries are not necessarily going to be the ones that are 75 and up or 65 and up. And so the prioritization also will change based on if vaccine passports are enacted, because then the focus will be on people that need to travel for work or whatever, instead of people that might have the most physical benefit from being vaccinated. So that's another like effect that we might see with vaccine passports.
With that, I think we're at time, and I want to thank Professor Mohapatra for doing something that is so very much in the spirit of this colloquium, which is putting work out there for discussion, which is what we're trying to do. And I want to thank everybody who's been coming to this and participating, because it's been so intellectually exciting for me. Those of you who are registered students, you will have reflections, and please communicate with me if you've got any questions about that. But all that said, a big round of applause.
Thank you so much. You guys gave me a lot to think about, so I appreciate it. And feel free to email me, anyone with, critiques, suggestions, anything. I'm open for it because this is a very still early piece. And the other thing that I forgot to say is that I'm also not sure like when this is going to be out. So that's also difficult in writing it, so thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone. See you next year.